Hi, good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about a certain kind of whale that is able to survive in deep waters despite not being able to breathe. I would like to reason as to why the whale behaves the way it does in deep waters, why the whale does not breathe and yet get its oxygen and survive. Not only survive but also find a prey, fight it, and consume it. So, the type of a whale that I'm going to talk about right now is a kind of whale that has a square head and a narrow jaw, and usually it is dark gray. And the name of this whale is a sperm whale. So, I would like to describe the journey of a sperm whale at the surface of the water first, from the surface of the water to the depths of water in an ocean. This journey it is going to carry out to find its prey. Its prey is a rubbery monster. It has tentacles and it also has a long beak and is able to suck its food pretty well. It is a dangerous prey, and the name of this prey is called a giant squid. So, the sperm whale targets the giant squid, but the problem is the giant squid is at a very high depth beneath the surface of the ocean, generally, typically at around 1 kilometer, and it is very tough to survive at such depths. And yet, the whale had found ways to be able to survive, not only survive but also fight its prey and ultimately consume it. So, firstly, once the whale starts descending down into the deep depth of water, for every meter that the whale descends, the lungs of the whale will have to contend with the weight of the water above it. For example, if the whale descends 1 meter, the lungs will have to bear a pressure of the weight of 1 meter of that water. And subsequently, if the whale descends more and more, with every adding meter, there'll be more pressure on the external pressure on the lungs of the whale. So, on, in the top of on the in addition to the atmospheric pressure, when the whale is at the surface, the whale has the atmospheric pressure. It has to the lungs of the whale. The lungs of the whale are inside the whale, but the effect of the atmospheric pressure external to the whale will be felt by the lungs, in addition to the atmospheric pressure which the whale will have to bear with when the whale is at the surface of the water. As the whale gets deeper and deeper into water, it has to contend with the weight of the water above it. So there is extra added external pressure on the lungs of the whale. Now let me describe as to how the gases inside the lungs, that is majorly nitrogen and oxygen, respond to this high external additional extra pressure of water as the whale descends into the depths of water. Firstly, the lung will compress because there is high external pressure from the water as well as the atmosphere. And because of such a compression, the molecules of oxygen and nitrogen both collide within themselves. They collide more rapidly than they did if the whale was at the surface of the water, more vigorously than if it is at the surface of the water. The molecules also collide with the interior walls of the lungs. The difference between the collisions at the when the whale is at the surface of the water and at a certain depth in water is that the collisions will be more rapid and more molecules of oxygen and nitrogen will hit against the wall of the interior walls of the lungs. And because there are extra molecules of nitrogen and oxygen are, as a whole they'll be constant, but the those extra molecules that would hit against the wall would push the interior of the lung against the external pressure of the water and the atmosphere as the whale descends into certain depth. So in effect, what happens as a result of a whale descending into a depth is its lung shrinks, and also the gases in the oxygen and nitrogen will exert more pressure than they would have if they were at the surface of the water, if the whale was, the sperm whale was at the surface of the water. So let me take a depth of 10 meters. At this depth, it is found out that the volume of the lungs becomes half that of what the volume would be if the whale was at the surface. And because the lungs shrink, the pressure inside the lungs, that of the molecules of nitrogen and oxygen, becomes twice as much. In other words, the nitrogen and oxygen collide twice as much as what they did if they were at the surface of, if the whale was at the surface of the water. But at a depth of 10 meters, it is hardly any depth. But for the whale to be able to catch its prey, it has to go down around 1 kilometer below the surface of the water. At that depth, what would be the volume of the lungs? At that depth, the volume of the lungs would be 1% of what it is if the whale were at the surface. That is really, really compressed, really small lungs. It's as if the lungs are not even there, very small. And if you were to argue with what would be the pressure of oxygen and nitrogen within the lungs at the depth of 1 kilometer with an incredibly reduced volume of lungs, the pressure would be 100 times higher than it would be at the surface of the water. And there is a high consequence for such a large pressure of the nitrogen and oxygen within the lungs of the sperm whale. And the consequence is there are these delicate structures within the lungs that facilitate an exchange of oxygen and many other gases into the bloodstream, and also carbon dioxide. So there is an exchange of gases between the lungs and the bloodstream of the whale, and it's facilitated by this delicate structure called alveoli. But what happens at high pressures of nitrogen and oxygen is there would be extra molecules of nitrogen and oxygen that will enter the bloodstream, which is facilitated by the alveoli. And that is a problem for the whale, because if there are extra molecules than what the whale would require, especially with regard to nitrogen, the whale, once it reaches the surface for some reason, if it reaches the surface, the nitrogen in the blood would bubble up, and this is dangerous for the survival of the whale. This bubbling effect is what the divers call as an extreme case of bends, and it is dangerous for the life of the whale. So far, we have seen that as the whale descends into certain depths, the lungs shrink. The pressure inside the lungs, that of the gases, increases. And once the pressure increases, more number of molecules of the gases enter the bloodstream, and that is dangerous. But it is found out that the sperm whale, once it reaches the surface, is not damaged by the bubbling effect of nitrogen. It is in a healthy condition. What would explain this? What is really happening is at a certain depth, in this case around 1 kilometer, the alveoli, which facilitates the exchange of gases to the bloodstream, stops that facilitation. In effect, the alveoli shuts down. And what would happen? There would no longer be the exchange of nitrogen and oxygen to the bloodstream, and there won't be those extra nitrogen and oxygen molecules that would be in the bloodstream. And when the whale comes back to the surface, it need not be bothered about the effects of the bends or the bubbling of nitrogen, which is dangerous for its health. But a natural doubt that should come to a person's mind at this moment is, if the alveoli shuts down, if there is no facilitation of or the exchange of gases between the bloodstream of the whale and lungs, how is the whale getting its oxygen? The whale requires to swim, and unless it has oxygen to power certain chemical reactions that in its swimming muscles, it won't be able to swim. Over and above that, it also requires oxygen for its own survival. So it would be a great problem if the alveoli, which facilitates the exchange of oxygen and nitrogen into the bloodstream, is shut down. Where is the whale getting its oxygen? The answer to this question is, the evolutionary mechanism of the whale has found a way out of this to ensure that the whale gets its oxygen even at certain depths, even when the alveoli shuts down. In effect, without the whale having to breathe, because the alveoli shuts down in the lungs, it is getting oxygen for it to power the chemical reactions that would cause it to swim, that would cause its muscles and that would cause its muscles in the swimming muscles to be activated and allow it to move. And that evolutionary mechanism is, the whale has a lot of hemoglobin. It has twice as much of hemoglobin as a human being has. And because of that, when the whale is breathing at the surface, it is able to breathe in a lot of oxygen, and the hemoglobin, which is twice as much as that of the humans, would store more oxygen than it would do for humans. That is one way in which the whale is able to source its supply of oxygen even when the alveoli shuts down, even when the whale does not breathe. There's another way in which the whale sources its oxygen, and it comes from the muscles of the whale. The muscles of the whale consists of a protein that stores oxygen, or in effect the energy that the whale would require when the whale ceases to breathe underwater. And this protein is called myoglobin. It's 10 times the amount as compared to a human being in a whale. In effect, what the evolutionary mechanism of the whale had decided is, shut off the alveoli, the whale won't breathe, but it will still get its essential source of energy, oxygen, from its reserves, which are in its bloodstream as well as in its muscles. So the whale at around a depth of 1 kilometer is looking for its prey. it has a mechanism to find its prey also, and this mechanism is the mechanism of sound. It gives some loud clicks, and once those sound signals hit an object or its prey, they reflect back to the whale it's a kind of an echo, and the whale hears that reflection and makes a decision of whether if it is a prey or not, and from this it gets to know the location of the prey, in this case the giant squid. When the sperm whale comes near the giant squid is caught unaware because the giant squid cannot hear. Just a second, yeah. So, despite not being able to hear, it has tools to fight off the sperm whale. It has the long beak, a characteristic of a giant squid. It has tentacles, it has great suckers, and it has these tools that it can defend itself. But despite that, it has been found out that many of the dead sperm whales have these beaks of giant squids within their stomachs. These beaks cannot be digested, hence they are stuck in the stomach. And from this, it can be understood that ultimately it is the sperm whale that would consume the giant squid in its battle against the giant squid. And finally, after consuming the giant squid, the whale has to come back to the surface because the reserves of oxygen in its muscle and blood is only enough for about 1 hour or 45 minutes. It has to once again breathe, and it can do so when it reaches the surface of the water. And hence it makes a routine journey back to its surface. It breathes there again and again, breathes in oxygen and takes a great amount of oxygen with it because it has a large amount of hemoglobin, twice as much as that of humans. And what also happens as the whale reaches the surface or at the surface is that the lungs, which have shrunk when the whale has descended into certain depths, would reinflate, and they would also get connected to the bloodstream because the alveoli would once again be active. So from this video, what I want you to focus or tell the audience is that firstly, with an increase in the external pressure with respect to the lungs of the whale, there is a reduction in the volume of the lungs of the whale. There is an increase of pressure of gases within the lungs of the whale. So this is what happens to the pressure of the gases with a reduction in volume. And the pressure of the gases is also dependent on two things. The first thing is how hard the gas molecule hits the walls of the lungs, which in turn depends on the speed of the gas molecules and the mass of the gas molecules. More the speed of the gas molecules or the mass of the gas molecules, more harder would the gas molecule hit the interior of the lungs. The pressure also depends on a second aspect, and that second aspect is the average number of the gas molecules inside the lungs. If they are more, the pressure inside the lungs would be more. And the third aspect that I would like to emphasize on is once the lungs compress as the whale descends, the lungs just don't keep compressing forever. There's a point at which the lung ceases to compress anymore, and that is the point when the collisions of the gases inside the interior walls of the lungs have balanced the external pressure that the lungs feel. And as I told you, at a depth of 1 kilometer, that pressure or the hard collisions or the collisions by the extra molecules of the nitrogen and oxygen into the interior walls of the lungs becomes 100 times that of the atmospheric pressure or the pressure at the surface. So there is an equilibrium point reached, and More the average number of molecules, more would be the pressure. And how is the volume regulated? Volume is regulated based on what would be the pressure inside and what would be the pressure outside. The lungs would compress if the pressure external to the lungs is more than that within the lungs. In one case, the pressure external to the lungs is the water, is caused predominantly by water, in addition to the atmospheric pressure as well. And in another case, the pressure inside is caused only mostly by the gases inside the lungs. I hope you found this description of how a sperm whale attacks a giant squid and the mechanism of how a sperm whale survives in water, in deep waters. Thank you.